Chapter 11 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 11. A Newly Shaped Cross. Ruth Erskine, meantime, was keeping up her struggle, having intervals when she seemed to be making headway, and felt as though she had reached higher ground, only to be dropped suddenly down again into the depths of despair by some unfortunate encounter with the newcomers. No more definite comment on the existing state of things could be made than is shadowed in that expression, newcomers. They still continued to be thought of as such in the house. They did not drift into the family ways or customs. They did not assimilate. Everything was so new to them, so unlike their entire former education, that much of the time they stood one side and looked on, instead of mingling and having their individuality lost in the union. So far as Mrs. Erskine was concerned, she did not look on quietly. It had been no part of her discipline to learn quietness. She talked everywhere, under the most trying circumstances, and she seemed always to chance upon the things to say that were particularly unfortunate just then and there. This being the case, it is perhaps not strange that the rasping processes were so numerous that there was not time between them for healings. Judge Erskine, on his part, made nearly as little progress. Being a man of faultless grace and bearing, and being noted for fastidiousness, made him preeminently susceptible to wounds in these directions. Generally, he and Ruth maintained the strictest silence toward each other concerning their trials, they having, by tacit consent, agreed upon that as the safest course, but, occasionally, they were rasped into comparing notes. In the hall one morning, where many of their confidential conversations were held during these days, her father stopped her with an almost petitioning question. "Daughter, was it very trying yesterday when Mrs. Blakesley called?" "As trying as it could be, sir," Ruth answered, still smarting so much under that recent infliction that she could not bring her voice to a sympathetic tone. Mrs. Blakesley, being a woman who hasn't an ounce of brains herself, has, as you may imagine, none to spare for other people. Indeed, father, I sometimes feel as though this matter of making and receiving calls was going to be too complicated a thing for me. I never was fond of such duties, as you may remember, and now it is absolute torture, long drawn out." "I know it," he said, wincing and growing paler under each stabbing word from his daughter's lips. "It was all folly, I am afraid. I thought we would try to do just right, but I do not know but we would have felt it less, and they had been just as happy, if we had resolutely closed our doors on society altogether, and borne this thing among ourselves." What these two people needed was some strong voice to remind them how many, and how much harder troubles life had than they had been called upon to bear. Despite Marion Dennis's opinion, this is, or it should be, a help. By comparison with another's trials, we ought to be led to feel the lesser nature of our own. Failing in that, it sometimes happens to us to decide as to which of our own trials has the heaviest hand. "I don't think that would have been possible," Ruth answered, her tone somewhat subdued, as it always was, by a realization of her father's deeper wound. "But, I wish with all my heart, I saw a way to escape from some of this calling. There are hundreds, almost, yet to make, and some of them more formidable than any we have attempted, and the list continues to swell every day." The father had no answer. He saw no way out. And yet a way was coming, swiftly, one which would help them both out of this dilemma at least. It was the very next morning that Judge Erskine failed to appear at the breakfast table, and his wife brought word that he was most uncommon restless all night, and pretty fevery, and resisted all her suggestions to give him a good sweat, or to drink any bone-set tea, or even to soak his feet in mustard water. Consequence was, he didn't feel able to raise his head from his pillow, and wouldn't so much as let her speak of any breakfast, though she did tell over several things to him that she thought he might relish. Ruth groaned inwardly, not so much at anxiety for her father, his sicknesses were slight affairs, soon over, and his most sovereign remedy had hitherto been to be let alone. How, then, had he borne this fearful infliction of sympathy and fertile suggestion? But the sickness, whatever it was, did not pass away as others had done. Ruth visiting him, and seeing the fevered face and anxious eyes, felt a nameless dread, and entreated that Dr. Bacon might at once be summoned, being even more alarmed at the fact that her father immediately acquiesced. Dr. Bacon was slow in coming, being a man much sought after in his profession. But he was also unprecedentedly slow in leaving, making a call, the length of which amazed Ruth, and at which she did not know whether to be alarmed or relieved. During its continuance Judge Burnham stopped to inquire as to some law papers, and also apparently to make a call, for he tarried after he found that he could not accomplish his original errand, and was in the hall in the act of leaving when the doctor came, with slow and thoughtful tread, downstairs. That gentleman caught at his familiar face as if it were a relief. "Ah, good morning, Judge," he said. "This is opportune. May I have a word with you?" And then he unceremoniously pushed open the library door, and both gentlemen retired within, leaving Ruth perplexed, and perhaps a little annoyed. The door closed upon them. Dr. Bacon was not long in making known his thoughts. "Judge, are you an intimate friend of this family?" "Why," said Judge Burnham, hesitating, and flushing a little over the question, "I hardly know whether I may claim exceeding intimacy. The Judge is not apt to have very intimate friends. Perhaps I come near it as anybody. Yes, I think I may say I am considered a friend, by him at least. Why, may I ask?" "Because they need a friend, one who is not afraid of himself or his feelings, and can help them plan, and perhaps execute." "What on earth do you mean? Is the Judge so very sick?" "Well, as to that, he is likely to be sick enough; sicker, indeed, than I care to have his daughter realize just at present. It is a very marked case of a very undesirable type of smallpox. Now don't back out of the nearest door and leave me in the lurch, for I depend upon you." This last as Judge Burnham uttered an exclamation of dismay, and stepped backward. The sentence recalled his self-possession. "Don't be disturbed," he said, and his tones were somewhat haughty. "I have not the slightest intention of fleeing. I shall be glad to serve him and his family to the best of my ability. But what is there for me to do? Is he aware of the situation?" "Most decidedly so. I didn't mince matters with him. He is not one that will bear it. He knows all that I do, and is as clear-headed as usual. He knows certain things that must not be done. For instance, his daughter Ruth is, on no account, to be allowed to put her head inside the door. He was peremptory about that, and must be obeyed, though there is no earthly fear of infection for some days yet. But I have given my word of honor that it shall be as he says. The trouble is, they will be left in the lurch. There isn't a smallpox nurse in the city that I know of. I would have given $50 an hour almost, for a good one last night, and besides, the servants must be informed, and they will leave to a man or a woman. In books you are always reading of heroic servants who are willing to take their lives in their hands, and stand by their mistresses through anything. I wish I could find a few of them. I would promise them high wages. Well, now, what you can do first, is to explain the state of affairs to Miss Erskine. I would sooner try to explain to an iceberg or a volcano. I am never quite sure which she is. And then, if you have any wits, set them to work to establish communication between this house and the outer world. In other words, do what you can for them, if you can. You know better than I do whether you are on sufficient terms of intimacy to do anything with her. The old lady must be told, I suppose, though Judge Erskine didn't mention her at all. Perhaps she will want to get out of the house, somewhere, and very likely you can manage that. At least the first thing of importance is to tell Miss Ruth. Will you do it?" "Yes," said Judge Burnham, speaking slowly and hesitatingly. It was by no means the sort of communication that he desired to make to her, yet he felt an instant desire to stand by her, and, if disagreeable tidings must be given, bear them himself in whatever alleviating way he might. "Very well," said the doctor promptly. He was spending a great deal of time on this case, and was getting in haste. I ought to have been off 15 minutes ago, but Judge Erskine wanted all the affairs of the nation arranged before I left. He knows what he wants, and, so far as it is within the compass of human possibility, he intends to have it. Will you see Miss Ruth at once, and do what planning you can? Meantime, I will make one more dash for a nurse. No one is to go up to Judge Erskine until I see him again. I fancy he wants to do some thinking for himself. That is his peremptory order, and it will be well enough to obey it. There is no sort of danger of infection now, you understand, but he is quite as well off alone for a little. Now, I positively must go. I will look in on my way down the square and report further." And then the great doctor took himself off, leaving Judge Burnham with the worst case on his hands that had ever fallen to his professional life. He walked slowly toward the door, but before he could pass out it was pushed open by Ruth, her face white and frightened. "Judge Burnham, what has happened? What is the matter? Is my father so very sick? And why am I not allowed to go to him?" "One thing at a time, dear friend," he said, and his voice had a touch of sympathy that could not have escaped her. "Your father is not alarmingly sick, but the sickness is of such a nature that he will not have you exposed to it even for a moment. It was his first thought." And then he pushed a chair forward and gently placed her in it, and sat down beside her, telling her briefly, rapidly, in a half-professional manner, all he knew himself. He was a good student of human nature. His success in his profession would have proved that, and he knew it was the surest way to hold her self-controlled and ready for intelligent thought. He had not misjudged her character. She neither cried out nor fainted. She had been pale enough before, but her face whitened a little, and she covered her eyes with her hands for an instant. It was a curious revelation to her of the strangeness of these human hearts of ours, when she remembered afterward that, flashing along with the other crowding thoughts as to what and how, there came the swift memory of the yesterday's talk, and the instant realization of the fact that they would have neither to make or receive any more of those dreadful calls, for some time at least. Just a moment of hiding behind those hands, and then she was ready for action. "Judge Burnham, have you thought about what ought to be done first, and if you have, will you help me? It makes it harder, because my father will not let me come to him. If we could talk together, if he would let me be his nurse, I could—" And then she hesitated, and her lip began to quiver. She remembered that her father was the one person whom she had to love. "There is no use in talking about that," Judge Burnham said, hastily. "The doctor said he ought, by all means, to be humored in this matter; that it would help to keep him calm, and thus hold the disease in check. You should not have a thought of going to him. Some nurse can surely be found. People will do anything for money. I suppose, Miss Erskine, it will be necessary to tell the other members of the family?" "Of course," Ruth said, and she tried not to shiver visibly, as she thought of what Mrs. Erskine might say, and wondered whether she was one of those women who were ignorantly and wildly afraid of infection, and whether there would be a scene with her, and what Susan would do or say. Then she thought of the servants. "Hannah and Thomas and the rest ought to be told, ought they not, Judge Burnham?" Then she suddenly roused from her half-suppressed, appealing tones, and rising, said, "How foolishly I am talking! This thing has startled me so. Of course they must be told, and it should be done at once. I will take no unfair advantage of them in any way. Yes, I will tell Mrs. Erskine and my sister. Thank you, Judge Burnham." And that gentleman began to consider himself as almost dismissed from her presence. "What can I do for you first?" he asked her, eagerly. "I am not one of those who are afraid of anything, Miss Erskine, in mortal guise at least. I am going up to see your father, and since you cannot go yourself, you might make me your messenger, to say anything that you would say, that you are willing to have me repeat." Her eyes brightened. "Thank you," she said. "It is very pleasant to feel that you do not want to desert us. But I will not trouble papa until I can tell him that we are arranged somehow, and that he need not worry." She went down first to the kitchen regions and summoned the working force, telling them in brief, clear language what had fallen upon the house, and offering them each 2 weeks' wages in advance and good characters. She was young, and had not been put to many such tests. They were not "servants in a book," it appeared, for they every one eagerly caught at their liberty, and were nervously anxious to get out of the plague-stricken house, not even desiring to wait until Ruth could get her pocketbook and make good her word. They were young and ignorant, and in the great outside world they had friends. Life was dear to them. Who shall blame them? And yet, I desire to say, just here, that it is not in books only that noble, self-sacrificing exemptions to this form of selfishness are found. I have known kitchens that ought to have glowed with the beauty of the strong, unselfish hearts beating there, through danger and trial and harassing toil. It only happened that Ruth Erskine had none of those about her, and, within half an hour after the first word had reached them, she stood alone in her deserted kitchen, trying to get her nerves quiet for the next, and, to her, more trying ordeal. What would these new elements in the household say? Was Mrs. Erskine given to hysteria, and would these startling developments produce an attack? Would they want to get away from the house? Could they be gotten away, quietly, to some safe place? Would Susan be willing to go? How would she take the news? Ruth puzzled her brains some weary minutes in trying to decide just how they would act, and whether she had courage to tell them, and whether it were not altogether possible that Mrs. Erskine might be moved to make such an outcry as should disturb the sick man upstairs. At last she gave over the attempt to arrange their actions for them, and went to summon them to the library, with an air of forced calmness, and a determination to have this worst feature of the side issues over as soon as possible. Chapter 12.